All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore what is honestly one of the most fascinating historical crossroads in human history. Imagine humanity's greatest intellectual traditions starting at the exact same point in time, completely isolated from each other, yet ultimately paving completely different paths for civilization. It's just an incredible story of human thought, and we're going to trace how our ancestors built the very frameworks we still use to understand reality today.
So it's a massive question, right? Why did they evolve in completely opposite directions? To get it, we really have to examine two ancient civilizations, India and Greece. We're talking about two cultures separated by thousands of miles that suddenly, almost like this synchronized glitch in the Matrix, started asking the biggest questions imaginable. Questions about existence, the cosmos, and, our place in it all. Yet the answers they came up with pushed them down entirely opposite tracks.
Historians call this remarkable window of time the Axial Age. The philosopher Karl Jaspers actually coined that term because he saw this era as the literal pivot, or the axis, upon which all of human history turned. You can think of it as a shared starting line. During this period, these profound intellectual traditions were birthed in both India and Greece, producing humanity's most enduring frameworks for truth. But, as we'll see, a shared starting line definitely doesn't guarantee a shared destination.
Let's start with Path A, India's inward turn.
Tracing India's intellectual journey, we see it move through three pretty distinct phases. It kicked off around 1500 BCE with the early Vedic tradition, which was super focused on rituals, sacrifices, and worshipping many deities. Then we hit that middle period, the Hindu Axial Age, stretching roughly from 800 to 300 BCE. And finally, the tradition shifts into the era of the Epics and Purāṇas. But let's zoom in on that very first phase for a second to see where it all began. Back in that early Vedic phase, religious life was basically just about identifying the right deity for a specific sacrifice. It was an entirely outward-looking practice. If you wanted a good harvest or, say, success in battle, you asked which god should be worshipped and what is the exact chant I need to reach them. For instance, you might invoke Agni, the fire god, acting as a literal messenger to carry your physical offerings up into the heavens. The answers they were looking for were purely external. But then, during the Hindu Axial Age, which was marked by those transformative texts known as the Upanishads, the central question radically shifted. These texts, whose name literally translates to sitting down near a teacher, represented a massive philosophical leap. It was no longer about looking up at the sky trying to figure out which god to appease. The question became deeply personal, deeply internal. Who am I? And alongside who am I, the brilliant thinkers of the Upanishads started asking, what is the ultimate reality? The focus moved entirely away from all those external rituals and turned into this really deep, internal philosophical inquiry. They just weren't satisfied with mythological explanations of fire gods and sky deities anymore. They wanted to strip away the illusion and understand the absolute fabric of existence itself. This Upanishadic shift moved the search for truth firmly inward. They zeroed in on concepts like Ātman, meaning the inner self, and Brahman, the ultimate universal principle. Think of it like, actually picture a single drop of water. That's Ātman. Now imagine that drop realizing it is fundamentally made of the exact same stuff as the entire infinite ocean, which is Brahman. It became a profound exploration of consciousness and self-realization. The ultimate truth wasn't something you sacrificed to on an altar anymore. It was something you had to realize within your own mind. Which brings us to the next phase, Hinduism's return to myth. Now, you'd kind of expect that intense philosophical inquiry to just keep accelerating into total abstraction, right? But the Indian tradition took a really fascinating turn. Through monumental texts like the renowned Mahabharata and the Ramayana, alongside the Puranas, mainstream Hinduism gradually shifted its focus back outward. The intense introspection of the Upanishads started sharing space with a return to mythology. We see the dramatic rise of personal gods, the practice of devotional worship, known as bhakti, the establishment of complex temple rituals, and a really deep reliance on sacred narratives. So on one hand, you have the Upanishadic revolution, which is all about rigorous philosophical inquiry and the exploration of internal consciousness. But on the other side, you have the reality of much of popular Hinduism today, where belief in God, divine incarnations, miracles, and these rich mythological stories have become incredibly central to daily practice. The civilization went from external ritual into internal philosophy,
and ultimately returned to a deeply mythic and devotional framework. All right, switching gears, let's look at Path B, Greece's outward turn. Very much like India's starting point, early Greek thinkers relied heavily on mythological explanations of nature. You know the drill. If there was a storm, Zeus was angry. If the seas were rough, Poseidon was upset. But as they entered their own axial age, they pivoted dramatically. And unlike India, they completely severed ties with divine explanation for the natural world. It was a one-way ticket for Western philosophy, and they literally never looked back. Historians usually call this the shift from mythos to logos. Basically, the Greeks started to systematically abandon mythological explanations for nature. Instead of relying on the arbitrary whims of the gods, the mythos, they hunted for logos, rational, observable, and universal principles underlying the cosmos. Early philosophers like Thales started looking at water as a fundamental element, while Pythagoras looks to mathematical structure rather than gods to explain reality. They fully embraced logical reasoning and empirical observation. And this is where the divergence becomes, well, permanent. Instead of returning to myth as its dominant framework, the Greek intellectual tradition just kept compounding on itself. Classical philosophers like Aristotle laid down the absolute bedrock of categorizing the natural world. Centuries later, that meticulous foundation fueled the scientific revolution, accelerated the Enlightenment, and eventually gave rise to modern science. This path continually emphasized critical inquiry, hard evidence, and the systematic investigation of the natural world.
And that brings us to these two diverging legacies.
The contrast here is stark and honestly just deeply fascinating. Looking at the big picture, we can objectively trace how India moved from the external rituals of the Vedic period right into the deep introspection of the Upanishads, but ultimately returned to a popular practice centered on myth and devotional religion. Meanwhile, Greece started with myth, pushed outward toward objective reason, and continued along a relentless path that culminated in modern science. Despite sharing this incredible moment of profound awakening during the Axial Age, their long-term trajectories diverged, shaping human history in two entirely distinct ways. One sought the truth by looking infinitely inward into the self and the divine, mapping the landscapes of human consciousness. The other sought the truth by looking infinitely outward into the mechanics of the cosmos, mapping the literal stars and elements. So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. We don't just study the Axial Age because it's interesting history. We study it because these deeply rooted ancient paths actually continue to influence our modern world every single day. When we search for meaning today, whether that's through spirituality, mindfulness, empirical data, or the scientific method, we are still walking the divergent paths forged thousands of years ago in India and Greece. So, which path do you find yourself leaning on when you try to make sense of the world?